evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic and built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. So I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite public programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blender Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to preservation in DC. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's presenter. Steve Knight is president of the Art Deco Society of Washington, as well as an architect and principal with firm David M. Schwartz Architects based in DC. Steve's interest in Art Deco covers many facets, including architecture, preservation advocacy, conducting educational walking tours, collecting vintage clothing and period furniture, and enjoying the era's music and film. So with that, I'm excited to pass things along to Steve.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Good evening, everyone. Great to be with you. Looks like a nice crowd. And I suspect it is a mix of friends of the Preservation League as well as friends of the Art Deco Society. So again, it's really great to be with you all. Really do look forward to giving this presentation on the subject of transportation and Art Deco, which I hope you find interesting. It was fun putting this together because there were just so many different angles it could take. And I hope you like the particular angle that I've taken. And I will explain a little bit more about that in a moment. I just wanted to start off by giving a brief elevator pitch on the Art Deco Society of Washington. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, we have been around since the early 1980s. We're an all-volunteer group that has a multi-pronged mission to preserve, educate, and celebrate the value of and beauty of this unique period of art and architecture between the two world wars. We have membership across the region. So in addition to the district, members stretch into Maryland as well as Virginia. Our roots are in architectural preservation, and I'll be touching on a couple of our early case studies in a little bit. And we are one of many societies that you find around the country. As you can imagine, Art Deco that reached its zenith in the 1930s, by the 1980s was coming on 50 years of age. At that time, it was a style that wasn't particularly well known or appreciated, but these buildings were by then preservation worthy. So a number of societies got formed. The first one was in Miami Beach, founded by Barbara Bear Kaplan in the late 70s. And after she got things sort of stabilized in Miami Beach, she then reached out and collaborated with individuals in other cities, including Washington, to get the society going here and elsewhere. Our members are interested in a variety of things. We are, in addition to being preservationists, we're greatly interested in architecture and design. We collect the art and the antiques, the vintage fashion, music, dance, and film. And we even like vintage cocktail recipes and get together every so often to share some of those. So how this is structured tonight. I'm going to lead off with kind of an Art Deco 101 intro, if you will, to just give you a better understanding of the origins and some of the defining features of the style. I'll then spend a few minutes talking about what was then an emerging profession known as industrial design, or what we think of today as product design, and how that informed transportation. And it's interesting that industrial design and the other elements of Art Deco, whether it's architecture or clothing design, these things really all sort of weave together, if you will. And then from there, we'll look at a number of notable examples in and around Washington of architecture that relates closely to the evolution of transportation in the area. So to start off, looking back, if you will, at sort of what is Art Deco, what is it all about? It's interesting that the term Art Deco didn't really come into fruition until the 1960s. It was really at a time when some historians, art historians, were looking back and at this unique period of the 1920s and 30s and the decorative arts. And one of the most seminal events that happened was in 1925, this very famous exposition in Paris, a very mouthful of a title you can see there. And the term Art Deco was coined. It was sort of hatched out of that broader, more expansive title for that famous exposition. That really very much was a codification of the Art Deco stylistic features. And it goes by a number of different names. These are a bit of a mashup nowadays, but if you get into a finer level of study, you'll understand the distinguishing characteristics, whether it's high Art Deco or Art Moderne or zigzag, but it's all very much of the same cloth. To just look visually at this incredible exhibition that happened in 1925 in Paris, it was international in scope. Invitations went out around the world. Interestingly, the United States chose not to participate. Then Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, did not believe that the US had anything modern that was worth sharing. And that was a specific request of the invitation. So interesting that he felt that way. Nevertheless, the exhibit was incredibly influential around the world. A number of American designers and merchandisers went over to see it. And the influence spread very quickly. These are some shots of interiors of some of the pavilions that were built. You can see that the style is very much mature and fully fleshed out by this period. And it's interesting, this is just a few years after World War I. And I think we have to keep that in mind and why the style emerged so quickly in Europe. And its origins really are in Europe. And it very much grows out of the destruction of World War I. And there was a radical need to rebuild, but there was also a radical need to just think differently, to think more positively, and to embrace technology and industry in a much more positive and uplifting way, much opposed to how technology and industry had embraced during the Great War. I think it's interesting to do the academic study that we all encountered in school at one point or another, known as the compare and contrast. And I think it's very clear when you look at two examples of wrought iron metalwork, the one on the left being Art Nouveau and the one on the right, of course, being early high Art Deco, you immediately see, while they're both gates and they're both very decorative, and they both have a stylistic flavor, each one is very different. Art Nouveau is very floral, it's fluid, it's natural, it's plant-like. Whereas the Art Deco example, it treats that ornamentation in a very different way. It's flattened, it's geometric, it's stylized, it's repetitive. And those are key features that run throughout the evolution of Art Deco from the late teens up to World War II, and even in some cases slightly beyond. And Art Deco is a really captivating style because it draws from so many other influential art movements that in some cases were contemporary, but in others, of course, preceded Art Deco. And it synthesizes these different art movements. And you see it in the work. You see elements of cubism. You see the stylization and the geometrization that you find in the Wiener Werkstatt at the turn of the century. You see sort of higher, more elevated examples of modernism in the international style. And again, what Art Deco does is it beautifully synthesizes so many of those influences in very clever sophisticated ways, but ultimately it creates, work is created that's very approachable. It's beautiful. It's legible. It's understandable. And in a lot of ways, it's a style that bridges between being progressive and modern, but also being a little more approachable and safe in some instances. When somebody wanted to be progressive and they didn't want to go too far off the page, so to speak, they would look to Art Deco, or what was really then known as modern. It was simply what's current, what's modern at the time. And the style does evolve over this 20+ year period. Early high Art Deco, and it does come to the States. We start finding it in the States, of course, by the late 20s, particularly in New York. It's more highly ornamented. So you get much more literal examples of that geometric ornamentation. I think a really great example, we all think of New York and the skyscrapers and the setbacks and the chiseling, which is very Deco in and of itself, but very much in response to zoning movements. When you look at some of these buildings, in particular, the Chanin building, the base of the building is an incredible example of high Art Deco. It just really embraces that post-war exuberance that was really fueled by a booming economy. And then as the style advances, of course, and sometimes this is some people, when they're perhaps trying to be a little more discerning in using the terms we think of as modern or late modern, or streamlined is another, that's a term you're going to hear again and again. But the ornamentation is pared down. I think in the two examples in the middle and the left are clear examples of that. And then, like really any movement, you at a certain point you can't think of it in such pure terms. It's organic, it's fluid. As the style evolves, there's overlap. And I think some of the hotels in South Beach, like the one on the right, speak very much to that interplay of higher Art Deco, decorative motifs, and more streamlined, pared down, rounded elements that speak of speed and motion and efficiency, which are also terms that come to mind, particularly with later Art Deco. So I mentioned the 1925 World's Fair. By the early 30s, as you can see, Art Deco in the States is fully embraced and matured and becomes very much its own thing. Our contributions are really to the later part of Art Deco, I think, in a lot of respects, in terms of this streamlining and the paring down. But in particular, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair was really sort of our first mark, if you will, at this international level of influence. And these fairs happened throughout the decades. There were a number of them in the 30s. They're very important communication tools. They tended to go on for several months, perhaps over a year, and they would draw people from around the world, let alone around the country. So you can imagine the kind of influence that these would have on tastemaking and design and consumption, such as it was at the time. And then just looking quickly at the interiors of a couple of the pavilions in Chicago in 1933. Speaking of communication, film really, with the advent of talkies in the late 20s, really comes into its own, and with the studio system and the tremendous backing that film got with a studio system with lots of craftspeople and workers and writers and designers. Again, films become very important communication tools, and these films are sent, they're promoted everywhere. So the reach that they would have and the influence they would have on the evolution of the style is really important as well. So now turning to industrial design. This is a profession that really didn't exist until the late 20s. That date is probably a little debatable. It almost doesn't matter. It's a profession that emerges hand in hand with Art Deco is the real point to make here. And a few things to keep in mind, just the number of products that were invented, radios, vacuum cleaners, with the advent and proliferation of electricity. These kinds of products and toasters and you name it were coming into homes, and we needed people to figure out what these things should look like. Yeah, and this is on the heels of not only the Industrial Revolution, but also the arts and crafts movement, where there's a growing interest in not just sort of putting products out there and letting them look like what they look like, but really with a more designerly artistic approach in giving them beauty and making them just desirable and approachable. And a number of the people that became industrial designers, well, they all came into the profession really by accident. They tended to be artists or illustrators, and really by accident, perhaps they were commissioned to do a promotional brochure for a product. And over time, they developed a relationship with a manufacturer, and they ended up designing or redesigning or refashioning products. And that's this example of one of the old-fashioned sales slip registers. I'm sure we've all seen these back in the day with the hand crank device. This device, the Whiz register, was a commission that was given to Walter Dorman Teague, one of the great industrial designers in the 1930s. You can see what he was given to work with on the left with the original design, and then what he did with it on the right. He streamlined it. He pared it down. This was in an effort to make it, the device, it just looks efficient. It looks clean. A number of the hard edges are removed. It just looks safe and approachable. And that kind of, and it becomes desirable in that respect. And those were the kinds of qualities that, those were the charges that the industrial designers had when they were given these commissions. Most of them tended to work independently. They had their own studios, and they were hired by different manufacturers to do different products. And and any number of things. I mean, Raymond Loewy did everything from steam-powered locomotives to the Coke bottle to the Greyhound bus. We'll see an iteration of that in a little bit. And so they were very multifaceted. And another important concept to keep in mind here is this notion of consumerism. And think back to what I said a moment ago about objects becoming approachable and desirable. We are now, by the 30s, we're in the grips of the Depression. So on the one hand, you had a lot of people out of work who couldn't earn and couldn't spend and buy things. So that put a lot of pressure on manufacturers. They had to be very competitive and very strategic. So their products had to be distinguished in some way. And they really embraced design in good taste and good aesthetics as a key distinguishing feature. But then again, while at the worst of it, 1 in 4 may have been unemployed, you frankly had 3 out of 4 that were still employed. And this is the heyday of labor unions really growing in influence and power. So a lot of these jobs were very good jobs, good blue collar jobs, good clerk jobs. Think of what happened here in Washington with the New Deal era. So these were people who, while their means were modest, they still had a steady income, and they were interested in acquiring, much like we all are to some degree, and they became enlightened, empowered consumers. And good design was a key part of that. The last element to touch on with industrial design is this notion of this real spirit of progress. Again, this grows out of World War I and the need to rebuild, and just, I think, the desire to think positively, to think progressively, to think forward, to think about the future, and really think about what that could be and what it could look like. And it was all part of an uplifting, positive movement. And that was very important, of course, through the Depression. We needed something positive to think about with all the gloom and doom that was around us. So designers, not only were they designing products in the day, they also, a lot of them had a visionary component, thinking ahead as to what things could look like. This is a really interesting graphic exercise that Raymond Loewy, he was just illustrating his sense of how the automobile would evolve, done in 1933. And you can see he's beginning to think ahead as you work across left to right. And at the same time, designers, they also had to hold themselves in check, because they knew if they got too far out there, their products would not be desirable either, because they would just be too foreign for people. So that was an important element that kept a lot of designers and manufacturers in check, so to speak. So now turning to some notable examples. This is broken down into a few sections. I want to start by talking a little bit about the automobile. Over the course of the Art Deco period, our automobile ownership increases about threefold over that 20-year period. So that's quite an impressive growth trajectory for automobiles. What do you do with these things? How do you accommodate them? And how do they influence architecture? How do they influence design? How do they influence infrastructure? So just what I'm about to do is this is a little bit of cherry picking of a few salient examples to just really illustrate some key themes here of Art Deco interplaying with transportation and design. So this is by no means intended to be exhaustive. We'd be here all night if we talked about everything. So the first thing I wanted to touch on was bridges. Washington has a really great inventory of beautifully designed bridges, a couple of them that really embrace Art Deco. The first one is, of course, the Klingel Valley Bridge along Connecticut Avenue that spans that tributary of Rock Creek Park. And this was Paul Cray, a great French expatriate designer who came to the States and settled in Philadelphia and taught and practiced from there. Did a lot of great commissions in Washington, Folger Shakespeare Library, and of course in Bethesda, the hospital. And this is one of his other commissions, the Klingel Valley Bridge. And I think one of the things I love to point out about this bridge, I love these urns in the image on the left. And this is an example for me of where Art Deco plays with other design styles. It's very much an Art Deco take on a Greco-Roman design element, this sort of Grecian urn that becomes a lantern. It's streamlined, it's pared down, but if you were to squint your eyes, you'd see something that's much more classical in nature. And Cray was a École de Beaux-Arts trained, so that's very much in his DNA. And that's a shot of the bridge under construction in 1935, then accommodating the soon-to-be defunct Chevy Chase Lake trolley line that used to run up and down Connecticut. And then a few other details. The railings on the bridge are great, just beautiful examples of high deco detailing with the inverted chevrons in the railings. And I think this is also a good example of when essentially a piece of infrastructure is really well considered and well designed, it becomes a piece of civic architecture. It becomes a monument. This is a beautiful place to just be a pedestrian. And most bridges designed today, you can't really say that about. They're not pleasant places to be in, but this bridge is a beautiful place to be. Another bridge also designed by Cray it was originally known as the Calvert Street Bridge, and then it became the Duke Ellington Bridge after the Duke passed away in 1974, rededicated. And this is a fun bridge because if you've ever, I'm sure a lot of you have been along Rock Creek, and it's wonderful driving under that arch, on Beach Drive. Again, it's a really great civic place to be as a pedestrian as you're negotiating between Adams Morgan and Woodley Park. And one of the key features here are these four pylons. They're sort of the bookends at each of the four corners, the two corners at each end of the span. And what really speaks to Art Deco here is the set of bas-relief panels that are carved into the limestone design and executed by Leon Hermont, really great, again, French-American sculptor who'd settled in Chicago. These two are two of the best, and they're basically, there's some sort of a Greco-Roman godlike or goddess-like figure cavorting with one of the modes of transportation, and they are the car, the ship, the plane, and the railroad. So here you're seeing the car with the goddess on the left, and the train, you could just make out the wheel underneath the leg of the god on the right. And I love in particular the carving and the attention to the detail and of the hair and the headdress of the god. It's a great example of, again, of Art Deco detailing and just that attitude of stylization and geometrization and repetition. Switching gears a bit here. Some of you are probably familiar with, we collaborated with Cleveland Park Historical Society a few years ago to do this walking tour. We've done it a few times since. And Connecticut Avenue is one of the great boulevards in American urban design. It's right up there with Michigan Avenue in Chicago and Park Avenue in New York. And each of these is very different. And one of the things that makes Connecticut so great is it really is the quintessential boulevard with some of the best addresses, the great apartment houses, the Kennedy Warren, Tilden Gardens, and a number of others. And one of the things I like to point out when talking about it is just how many different things are at play here that really make the avenue what it is and make the buildings what they are. And one of them is the zoning. The district passed its first zoning act in 1920, and it was amended over time. But one of the things it did is it really restricted where apartment houses could go and their behavior and their massing towards the street, if you will. And generally in that first iteration, and then as the plan evolved, it exchanged open space for additional height. So basically the more you set the building back from the street, you could get a little more height. That's a little simplistic, but that was the gist of it. And there are other influences here. The proliferation of a simple to use push button elevator meant that building footprints could be much more decentralized and expansive. And you could have elevators in different places, so you didn't have to negotiate a long corridor at the front end and back end of the elevator ride. And these are in essence, they're kind of quasi-suburban apartment buildings. And that's very much in the spirit and the character defining feature of Connecticut Avenue. And one of the things that does is and that goes hand in hand with the evolution of the automobile. And it really is interesting to look at how these buildings, because they're set back, they create space for the automobile with these wonderful entrance courts like we now have at the now fully completed Kennedy Warren with the circular drive and the plaza. And then of course the porte cochere. And that's a great design element that really comes into its own in the late 20s and early 30s. The Kennedy Warren with the stylized aluminum marquee is one of the best. Just around the corner from it, but off of Connecticut, is Woodley Park Towers. This building is another great deco building. It's a kind of a well-kept secret because it's not directly seen from Connecticut, but it has a great porte cochere as well, with this beautiful cantilever that sails out in metal from a sort of a more kind of heavy, robust masonry base with the piers. And then, of course, Sedgwick Gardens at the corner of Sedgwick in Connecticut. It has just some beautiful detailing in limestone, very high deco with the chevrons and the stylized heads, all rendered in limestone. And it also has these great light fixtures that behave like brackets under the marquee, and then they're become punctuation marks on the four columns. And then the last one to share is at 4801, a later building, 1938. This is sort of towards the end of Art Deco evolution. And this one just becomes just an unabashed, beautiful, very simple pared down cantilever disc. It just really just hovers over the little circular drive. It's beautiful. And then the glass block just lights up beautifully at night. It just really becomes a great beacon. So these things, they just really embrace the automobile, but they do it in a very humane and dignified way. And everything is scaled beautifully here. So that, you know, whether you're a pedestrian or you're arriving or leaving in a car, it feels very comfortable. Turning to where do we put the cars when we're not driving them? Buildings throughout the late 20s and 30s start adding very modest amounts of parking spaces by today's standards. In the case of Tilden Gardens, not Deco, but it is a really great example of how the architecture and the massing with this terrace, it's just a beautiful design opportunity that creates a great place to store about about a dozen cars. And then 4801 on the right, just seeing the door that takes you down into the basement, which is presumably a full or nearly full level of parking in the basement. And then looking to downtown, and there were a handful of really interesting structured parking garages in Washington. Really none of them exists anymore. One that's really great to talk about was the old Star Parking Plaza, developed by the publisher of the Evening Star newspaper, that took up a quarter block at 10th and East Street downtown. And I'm sure a number of you are familiar with John Joseph Early and his artisanal concrete design and fabrication studio. He was responsible for the exterior facade, which is a series of precast panels. And all of his work, these pictures don't quite do it justice because they're black and white, but the attention to detail with the aggregate and the colors of aggregate stone that is used to create the star motif in the image on the right, for example. And what he did here is the panels are pierced to obviously bring in light and ventilation, much needed light and ventilation into the garage. Great example. This one, unfortunately, no longer is with us, like most of them. Turning to shopping centers, this is something, shopping has been with us forever, but the idea of a dedicated, purpose-built place that aggregated a number of shops and also took the bold move of accommodating cars front and center. This was a problem that emerges in the 1920s with the proliferation of the automobiles. And what's really neat about it is there are so many examples of interesting shopping centers around the country. Forest Hills, New York is a great example. There's one in Ann Arbor that's really great. And you could see designers and developers, they're just experimenting. They're trying to figure this out. How do we accommodate the car? And yet there's this desire to still create really beautiful scale-giving architecture, to create places to use, in this case, and one of the first ones in Washington is the Park and Shop on Connecticut from 1930, a little more traditional style, admittedly, but this was revolutionary. The idea that you would, because up until then, and it reemerges in present time, but the idea of what we call contact area in the development business, the idea that you want as much the front-facing facade that people can see and touch as a pedestrian was really important and very valuable. So the idea that you would suddenly pull that back from the street to create a place for cars was a pretty bold and gutsy move. And I believe Richard Longstreth has a really great book where he goes through a really interesting narrative history of shopping centers in Washington. And one of the interesting things is most of these you find are on the right side of the street as you're headed out of town. And I guess the idea being you've worked downtown during the day and you're headed home to the suburbs at night. And so you're headed out and it's an easy free right into the shopping center. You can glide in, pick up what you need, and then head back out. But really moving into the thick of the Art Deco era, a great example. It's been pretty heavily altered, but it's still with us. It is interestingly landmarked. And thanks to the Preservation League for leading the effort to landmark it. Hopefully it will get put back together some way, but it's the Sheridan Theater and Shopping Center in Brightwood, just up Georgia Avenue. And it's a very modest example of a shopping center. I mean, we're talking accommodating probably 30 a couple of dozen cars in the little parking lot. But a number of these, they accommodated movie theaters, which were up through until you get into the 30s. Theaters tended to be downtown. They tended to be very large, opulent movie palaces. As the industry progresses into the 30s, there's a bit more of a rethinking of what a theater should be, and the advent of neighborhood theaters really came into the fore. So there's more of them. They're smaller, they're decentralized, they're not as opulent, but they are really great examples of streamlined design, modern design, late Art Deco design, and the original Sheridan was a great one. The designer, architect, Everson was very prolific. He was based in New York. He did he has well over 100 of these to his credit around the country. He did a handful of them here in and around Washington. And this is a great example. And interestingly, the set of shops that goes with it, with the parking off to the side, that was it's all part of the same development, but that was attributed to another architect. But it is interesting when you look at this at eye level that all the detail, this is the shoulder of the theater here on the left. You can see the theater mass and its roof rising beyond, but all of that detail carries around. So it was a very conscious effort to make a unified whole composition of theater and shopping center. And the brick detailing is really quite nice. And it's nice to see that most of this is still intact. Unfortunately, the marquee and the awning of the theater are no longer with us. The best example of an Art Deco era shopping center, at least that I'm aware of, and I may be a little biased, but it's the Silver Theater and Shopping Center, also done by Everson in Silver Spring. And it really just takes all of those themes to a whole heightened level. This is at the corner of Georgia Avenue running right left, and then Colesville running up and down on the page to the left. And it's pulled back, it's scaled up. You can imagine just gliding in here. And again, this is where the architecture really reinforces all of the concepts that the developer and the merchants were looking to capitalize on. The corners are rounded. The design is streamlined. It's approachable. You can imagine just gliding right in and getting a parking space and then going to a store or around the corner to yet another movie theater that is the anchor of this development as well. Another interesting feature of this one is you could call the parking in the front kind of the teaser parking, because by the late 30s, probably wasn't quite enough. So this one actually had a ramp that you could go down and duck under with your car, under the building, and then emerge and come back out again on the backside. And then you have a more substantial lot of parking in the back. And then just looking at a historic photo, the theater visible to kind of the left in the background of the image. There's a lot of topography here, and Everson really used that to his advantage. He could really show off the broad side of the theater. The front is rendered in limestone, as is the fronts of the retail. And then the rest of the bulk of the theater is a combination of tan and dark brick and these speed lines that it really feels like an ocean liner, particularly at the rounded back. And then this great decorative chimney accommodating the boiler at the back as well. And then I thought this is an interesting photo to include from a little later, 1950. You can see now how much the car and accommodating the car is taken over. And when you look at an image like this, I think two things. I think first, it's no wonder that Silver Spring was such a thriving retail center at mid-century, because there was plenty of room for parking, and that was obviously becoming very important. But at the same time, I can also imagine very quickly, by the time we get to the 60s, there's such a greater need for parking that there's just not enough room anymore. So ultimately, what was then the center of shopping in Montgomery County moves north to Wheaton, with Wheaton Plaza in the 60s. So turning now to buses, and obviously one of our great success stories here is the Greyhound Bus Station. And I think it's fun to just think a little bit, not just before the bus station, but how are you getting there? How are you leaving there? And let's think about the buses. And these are all from the 30s, and it shows an interesting evolution of bus design. The image at the top was one of those early models where Greyhound was pushing the designer to streamline the bus a little bit, but it was still very much the bus of the day. It's a bit clunky. It has that neat teardrop feature at the back of it, but it's a pretty heavy, clunky looking machine. And it's really the super coach from the mid 30s where the bus design is radically transformed. The cab and the driver is pushed forward. The full footprint of the bus, if you will, becomes an envelope for people and luggage. The floor of the bus is raised above the wheels, so you don't have that awkward, you're not awkwardly negotiating around the wheel wells with the seats and whatever else. And that obviously creates a great place for luggage. As we all know, we've all seen the bins doors lift up for the luggage storage underneath. And then of course the motor is then put in the rear of the bus also at that same level. So just an incredibly efficient, much more efficient use of the space, the volume of the bus. And then, and this is the bus that we famously think of when we look to the heyday of the early heyday of our Greyhound terminal here in Washington. But, and then Raymond Loewy was commissioned. He did a number of designs over the years, the 40s into the 50s and 60s for Greyhound. And this was his famous Silver Sides coach from 1940. And then you think, let's think a little bit about what bus travel was and how it got to be what it was. Carl Wickman, a very savvy businessman, starts, it was not known as Greyhound at the time, but he starts this small local bus service before World War I. Through a series of mergers and partnerships, he quickly grows the business throughout the 20s and then into the 30s. And by the thick of the 1930s, Greyhound has over 50,000 routes reaching to virtually every American town and city. That's pretty incredible. And just the sheer volume of service was incredible too, that in a typical year in the 30s, intercity buses were carrying over 400 million people. That's just an incredible volume. And then, well, maybe not quite as quickly as it grew, it does begin to decline in the 1950s with the advent of the interhighway system, and then just again the proliferation of the private automobile. But the buses, it's really fun looking at this brochure, and the idea that the bus was air conditioned and very comfortable plush seats. It was quite a different mode of transportation back in the day. That, I don't know, perhaps it is finding a bit of a resurgence with the intercity buses like the Bolt that go from here to New York. But obviously, let's turn to the building that our great example here, the Greyhound Bus Station at 1100 New York Avenue. This is back in the day in I believe around 1960, when it was fully in use as a bus station. The design was quite revolutionary. The firm Wishmeyer, Aerosmith, and Ellswick, based in Kentucky, they became sort of the go-to station for Greyhound. They did a couple of dozens of bus stations over the 20s and the 30s. And the Washington station was particularly noteworthy. It really was a game changer in the evolution of bus station design. Up until then, there were all sorts of awkward experiments. A lot of stations, the buses would just pull up to the curb and you would get out, and there would be this, you could imagine the tangle of people and luggage getting off and then people and luggage trying to get on. So what they hit upon here was what the prototypical concept was known as the island unit station, which, as the name implies, it's a building set in the middle of an open pad of space. So, and I think the form here very much is in lockstep with the function of how it worked. You can imagine buses coming along from the upper right along New York Avenue, and they make their right turn onto the side street, and then they can glide in, and the buses feed in and park in the back around the circular bus bays. And then I apologize for the resolution of the plan, but this is the main level floor plan. So New York Avenue would be, this is oriented just the way that aerial view is oriented. So you can imagine people coming in the main entrance, queuing in through the entrance doors, through into the lobby. There's concierge and luggage counters to either side of you, and then a very grand semicircular waiting room. And then the ticket office, ticket windows at the rear. And then from there, presumably after you've gotten your ticket and you've waited, you would then filter out through doors. This sawtooth, these would be the different parking lanes. So the bus would come around, feed in, it would head in, and you would, queue up, get on the bus, and the luggage would be loaded, and then the bus would do a very easy back out maneuver and then continue around the volume and then back out onto the street, and you are off. It's very clear and very logical, and I think we take it for granted today, but this was very revolutionary at the time. And there are terms that associated with this station. It was known as the Grand Central of Bus Terminals. It obviously had a handful of complementary shops and restaurants. There was a restaurant to the side here, then a few shops. There was a very noteworthy bookshop here for a number of years. This is a great historic image of a bus. This is one of those super coaches queued up at one of the bays, so you can see how that worked. So then turning to what's really an incredible preservation success story. In this, like all preservation success stories, it's very much a collaborative team effort. The Art Deco Society was heavily involved, the Committee for 100 was involved, the Preservation League was involved, and lots of others. Bus travel, as I mentioned, it sort of peaked in the 50s, it continues, and it still continues today, obviously, but by the 70s, this place and everything associated with it had gotten quite seedy. It was really not a pleasant place to be, but it was still functioning as a bus station. And we were coming on the country's centennial, and there was this grand, well-intentioned idea, well, we need to clean this place up, we need to spruce it up. So let's put what they did is they put essentially what's known as we've referred to it as a slip cover. It's a standing seam metal that was they just erected it as a shroud and entombed the bus station, but everything underneath was still very much intact. And it continued like this for about 10 years until the station ultimately closed and bus service got relocated over near Union Station. So this building was sat here vacant, and it had actually been sold to a developer by this time. So everybody was obviously very worried about what would happen to it. By this time, the land had become incredibly valuable. So everybody figured the station's days were numbered. It's a very long, drawn out story. I won't tell you every bit of it. It would go on for far too long, but suffice it to say that the station was thankfully designated in, I believe, 1987, when it still had this shroud over it. And part of the case for preserving it and designating it, rather, was that the building was still perfectly intact underneath. And folks knew that because they looked at the fabrication drawings for the shroud. And it was very clear that none of the stone or the wind, or none of the facade of the original building had been removed. And there was then after that success story, there's been a very long, drawn out series of battles as to what do we do with it. It has to be adaptively reused in some way. The land is so valuable. And what ultimately happened with the station, I think, speaks very clearly to just how valuable the land was. That the zoning here, just what you could build was a building of that height, and it was all about saving as much of this original station as possible. And there were a number of schemes that They either knocked the station down completely, they preserved only the thinnest portion of the facade, or they so greatly usurped the building that it just wasn't worth saving. And then ultimately, the right developer, property owner came along with good intentions to save it. And they basically had to exchange and give up some of their air rights, some of their density, some of their net rentable income, as you can imagine, to allow this an acceptable preservation solution to happen. And then on top of that, they committed funds to preserve and restore the station to its original glory. So now it basically functions as a lobby, an entrance lobby for the office building at 1100 New York Avenue. And the lobby is very much intact, and it's just a wonderful space inside. I'm going to go back for a second. I wanted to point out, this is great late modern deco streamlined design, but it's also very much appropriate for Washington. They use a great Washington material, Indiana limestone, for the bulk of the facade. They use a very simple dark black terracotta tile for the base. Very restrained, elegant use of materials and color palette. And then when you come inside, there's just with this, it's almost like a rotunda. It reminds me of so many of the great civic and public spaces in Washington. And it's a great one in its own right. And it has this great, almost circular sort of tray ceiling with an oculus in the middle, beautiful terrazzo floor. This is what you see today when you go there. So again, it is a really great preservation success story. Beautifully restored the terrazzo flooring. In the middle is the stylized Greyhound motif rendered in terrazzo. The lower parts of the walls, it's a combination of plastic laminate, a formica type material, as well as copper banding, accented banding. And I mentioned that before we leave the station, I did mention at the beginning of this that Aerosmith, the architect, designed a number of these around the country. And they're all they're very much in the same family. This one in Cleveland still functions as a bus station. It's very much in the spirit of the one we have here. It is a little later, late 40s, so it does go a little more modern, but I think you can see the same sort of kit of parts, some of the same family resemblance here as well, as you would in others that you'll encounter around the country. I think it's important to keep in mind, again, when I was chatting with Melissa earlier tonight when we were setting this all up, I said, one of the things when I was creating this program, I thought to myself, well, should I restrict myself to stuff within the district? And I thought, well, that doesn't really make sense, because I think when you think about transportation, you think about expanding one's view, one's boundaries, and those boundaries get blurred. And I've done it already with the Silver Spring shopping center. And obviously I have to do it again and end with the Washington National Airport, which really is ultimately, it is the gateway to Washington. And when you look at the historic terminal, which is what I'm going to take a couple of minutes and talk about here, you can see that it is very much the gateway to the capital city of the United States. There's an interesting history here. The historic terminal, as we know it, dates to the late 30s, early 40s. Before that, there was an airfield here in 1926, or close to here, really more or less where the Pentagon and its extensive parking fields are now located. Was originally what was known as Hoover Field. That's the original terminal in the upper center and the lower left images. And then in 1930, another airfield known as Washington Airport was put into use nearby. I believe these were both private. Oh, excuse me, that says Washington Airport, doesn't it? But these were two airports, private airports, that then merged in 1930. And incredibly, the merged airport abutted Highway US 1, and the runway was bisected by a very busy street. So they had to have traffic police stop traffic anytime a plane took off or landed. So that obviously would only work for so long. And the government was really hamstrung until President Roosevelt was able to put through legislation that enacted what was known as the Civil Aeronautics Authority, that basically allowed the government to create what would then become known as Washington National Airport. They selected a site just south of what's known as Gravely Point, now a park associated with George Washington Parkway. Most of the site was essentially water or mud flats or marshy land, so there was a great deal of fill. In the lower left image, you're seeing the site before the fill started. And in the lower right image, I think this is interesting because you can see with the ongoing fill project, the network of runways, the pattern of runways that's still there today starting to emerge. The supervising architect was Howard Cheney. He's the one he's credited. That's the name that you see in the cast of characters on the dedication plaques inside the terminal. It was learned through some more recent study that this gentleman, Charles Goodman, was likely the lead contributing designer on the project. And Goodman is interesting because he's noteworthy for a number of mid-century modern houses that you find in the Northern Virginia and Maryland suburbs. And this was an early image shortly after the the airport was dedicated in 1941. These are some great shots of a model that you can see. It's these, probably one of the original presentation models for the airport. And I think it's great to look at these for a moment to point out how the airport was laid out. It uses this broad crescent shape that on the entrance side in the image here on the right, it's a very welcoming gesture. And it indexes beautifully with a circular drive for pickup and drop off. And there's this central portico element that I'll talk about in a moment. And then from there, you get these beautiful canopies that sort of reach out like arms and follow the curve of the semicircular drive. Again, that's for pickup and drop off. And then looking at the image on the left, the airfield side of the airport, that crescent works beautifully on the backside because it's much more expansive and it gives lots of place for planes to queue and park and just all the associated movement and staging of passengers and luggage and service for airplanes. That shape naturally accommodates that. So it's essentially, there's a large pavilion in the middle, a three-story pavilion from the front side, 4 stories from the airfield side in the middle, and then these beautiful arms that reach out. The original design submitted was a little more in a sort of a mid-century modern vein. And Roosevelt looked at it and he thought, there's different versions of this story, but he, in essence, he thought it should be a little more traditional. He thought it should speak a little bit more to Washington, D.C. and some of our architecture. And in particular, some people believe that he was thinking of nearby Mount Vernon and the expansive river-facing portico there. And he thought that this should have one. It just would really speak much more to Washington, D.C., the place. And this is a detail of that portico is rendered. It's very, this is an interesting building. It doesn't exactly scream Art Deco. It has a lot, it's kind of a Rorschach test in a way. It's a little bit of international style. It's a little bit of rationalism. There are some nice Art Deco elements, but it's a beautiful building, and it is very indicative of the tail end of the era in lots of respects. These are some detail shots, maybe a little disorienting, I apologize, but of that portico. There's some beautiful precast concrete treatment here on both the floor paving as well as the ceiling overhead in the image on the left. And again, this is all the work of John Joseph Early. And those are all different colors of stone, aggregate stone. So you can imagine just the heightened level of craftsmanship it took to pull that off. It's just really incredible. There are some really fun decorative elements on the exterior of the building, the great US seal on the left. And then there's this really interesting element. There's a door, a single door at each end of the entrance portico, because it really wasn't it was not the dominant entrance element. It's really just there as a visual symbol. But anyway, this element over the door, to me, it looks like a stylized urn and sort of font, if you will, just let into the wall and rendered in a carved plaster or stone. And then on the back side of the terminal, again, there's kind of a portico motif. This does obviously move in a more sort of modern international style direction with these very thin, slender, round columns. And here you can see, just to talk a little bit about how the building was organized, actually bear with me, I'm going to go back a moment. So you would arrive at the level of the drop off, and you would go straight in, and that aligned with the level of the main lobby, waiting room, and ticketing and all of that. And then there was a full level below that. And again, they're taking advantage of a grade change here. So that I mentioned earlier, it's 3 stories on one side, 4 stories on the other. And that's because they're accommodating the luggage and the service, and passengers would then queue down stairs and head out to the airfield. Again, we take that bi-level organization very much for granted with airports, but this was very much ahead of its time in the day. And this was the pinnacle. This was the state of the art of airport design when this building was opened. So you're seeing that lower level here in the image on the right that indexes with the elevation of the airfield. It has this great, this is an open air terrace, if you will, that stretches along the bulk of the center building. And then that terrace even continues around along the 2 flanking wings. I think you get a better sense of it here with more people on the balcony. And this was just open, people could come here. This was obviously before a lot of the security and layers and layers and layers of security that we have nowadays. And then moving inside the terminal main lobby waiting area space, a fairly late image before the terminal was in effect decommissioned on the right, and then an image of the space today. It's very much intact. It's in pretty good shape for the most part. I think a few things have been changed over the years. There were a few renovations that they had to make when this was decommissioned, when obviously the Pelly terminal that we all know of, that where the bulk of the gates are now happened, but it's still very much intact. You can walk through here pretty freely. It's on the public side of security. They have some great exhibits on display here. I think these are interesting images, 1940s on the left, 1950s on the right, and you can just see how the nature of the waiting room changed. When the airport opened, there were only 2 airlines. I believe it was Eastern and TWA, or excuse me, American and Eastern or TWA. Anyway, it was a very small volume of passengers and air traffic, and then obviously that proliferated and grew over time. So with the number of airlines service increasing, they had to gradually take over space in the lobby for ticketing and so forth. There's this great restaurant. It's elevated at the end of, sorry, I'm going back here. At one end of the lobby is this grand stair that you can go up, and then this was, and it is now again, actually, a glass, storefront glass wall that then leads you into the restaurant. And this is that restaurant space. This is at the end. If you picture the model that I showed you a few minutes ago, those wings, the ends of them are fully rounded on the ends. So you get this beautiful panorama sweeping view. I believe this space, as well as the main lobby, they're now used as private event space from time to time. But at least the main waiting room is open to the public when it's not in use for a private function. Those wings also accommodated concourses. So you would queue out through the concourse and then go downstairs one level to the level of the airfield, and you would head out onto the tarmac to get to your plane. There's great details in here that, and if you think back to the statement I made at the beginning of this section about this really being the gateway to Washington, I think some of the detail and the ornament in the interior public spaces really speak to that. The element in the newel here, and it's also, you can see it visible over the doors on the right. This is known as a fasces, which is an ancient Greco-Roman iconographic element. It was represented a series of reeds or sticks that were bound together that it symbolized the magistrate and judicial authority. And then over time, that symbol came to mean government and sort of collective, the power of the collective will of the public. So I think when you see that kind of an element in an airport like this, it really does speak very much to Washington and what this city is all about. And you see additional details that speak to that. You know you're in Washington when you look at this beautiful frosted glass decorative spandrel panel over one of the portals to the concourses. You couldn't be anywhere else. So that's basically it. There are a few great resources that I wanted to share with you. These are books you may want to check out if you're not familiar with them. Washington Deco from 1984. Washington and Baltimore Deco a few years later is a great resource. And then the Streamlined Decade. It's kind of an antique at this point, but it's a great resource that really capitalizes and really helps you really fully understand what the movement was about. So I will stop there. Thank you for bearing with me. And Melissa, I will turn it over to you for some questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was such a wonderfully beautiful illustrated presentation. And it was really great to learn about all of these amazing places and examples of Art Deco. So yeah, we have some time for a few questions. Again, folks, you can put your questions into that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and like your kind of toolbar there. We do have a couple of comments in the chat. One person asks, are there any, I guess, examples or images of underground trains or stations, AKA the first metro in DC, that folded? I don't know if folded or flooded, but I don't know if you know of any examples or have any on the website.
I do not.
Yeah.
I purposefully sidestep trains here because I think of our great train station. It's not Art Deco. Right. And I know John DeFerrari's done a really great presentation on streetcars. I wanted to stay off the rails, so to speak, and leave that one to others. Other than the little subway that, at the US Capitol, I'm not aware of any. Perhaps there are, lengths of streetcar lines that were underground at some point here and there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't help further with that one.
That's fine. Yeah, everybody. Yeah, we on our YouTube channel, John's presentation about streetcars is on there. But then also, if you are just looking for images and stuff, Library of Congress, DC Public Libraries like Dig DC, National Archives, those might be good places if you're interested in looking around as well. Let's see. Lawrence asks, were there any Art Deco gas stations?
Yes, there are a number of them, and none of them are around anymore. Very unfortunate. The Silver Spring Shopping Center, interestingly, had a small service station right in the middle of the parking field out front. And you think nowadays to kind of modern shopping centers with their pad sites and their convenience stores, it was a kind of a scaled down version of that. And it was a perfectly beautiful little streamlined station that was very much in step with the rest of the complex. In Rick Striner's book, he does touch on a handful of stations here and there. I think one of the funnest ones, it's not Art Deco and it's actually getting adaptively reused, is one of the old Lord Baltimore stations that the Douglas Development Company took into their possession, and they're incorporating it into a sort of a little adaptive reuse complex. They actually moved the station across the street and assembled it with two other historic buildings, and that should hopefully be opening here in the next few months as part of a restaurant and bar complex.
Wow, that's great. David asks, are the remaining shopping centers threatened at all? They have very valuable footprints.
To varying degrees, sure. Obviously, designation is the best tool to save them. Thankfully, the Silver Spring Shopping Center is a designated landmark site. The Sheridan that I showed was landmarked. The Cleveland Park Shopping Center, it's a contributing resource to that historic district. It's not landmarked in its own right. And there are others. They're in various states. There's another one in Tacoma Park, the Flower Shopping Center. They designated the theater. Unfortunately, we tried to get them to designate the connecting shopping center with it, but the county didn't bite on that one, unfortunately. It all sits there, its extent to this day, but I think its days are numbered, frankly.
Oh, that's tough.
That's the sad fact of a lot of commercial development and architecture.
Yeah. Anita, not really a question, but kind of a comment about the Greyhound Bus Station. So she said, a few months ago, we had a brief period of being out. I stopped by to look at the lobby again. They were very gracious about letting me in to look around. I hadn't been there in a number of years, and it was great to see what good shape it is in.
Yeah, they have taken really good care of it. They're very good stewards to that building. And there is an exhibit in there. This reminds me, it's a good thing to mention. It's a great interpretive exhibit that tells the whole story of Greyhound as well as the preservation story. A number of really beautifully done placards and boards and so forth. And that's open to the public. So they were right to be gracious because they're required to be gracious. That was one of the negotiation elements of the whole preservation adaptive reuse, is they had to create that exhibit and make it open to the public. So if they're never not gracious, let me know. We'll beat up on them.
Great. I guess another question about the Greyhound station and its history. So somebody asked, did the station have kind of segregated entrances for white and African-American like patrons, or like kind of what, do you know of any of the history, I guess, about that?
I'm sure they did. And I apologize for really coming up short on that piece of history. I think this is something that our organization is just really beginning to deal with, like a lot of organizations. We're really trying to broaden our understanding and just our of the history of the narrative history of history. And there's so many more chapters we need to be exploring and telling. And that's what makes history so interesting, is it, much like we all evolve, history evolves with it. There is, just on a related note, it is noted that some of the civil rights bus rides of the 1960s, the Great Freedom Ride, did originate. Two of the buses did originate at at the Greyhound Station.
Mhm.
Excuse me, I think one bus originated there, and then another one originated at the Trailways Station
Mm.
just across the street. So it's really important history that
Yeah.
needs to get added to, the whole narrative for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something, even DCPL, kind of looking back at sites that are already nominated and seeing like certain, like omitted stories, and, there's a lot of work being done on like context studies and multiple property documents. So this is definitely something that will be seen more of in now and in the future. So
I think when we can get our hands on original architectural blueprints,
mhm.
those are really good indications because they very clearly documented, because it was just part of the design.
Yeah.
I gotta have a door for these folks, and I gotta have another door for these folks. I gotta have bathrooms. I've gotta have all those things. And they were separate. They were not equal, but
Right.
but they were there and they were separate.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see here. A couple more questions. So, okay, Kathy, I guess she says, I recall a garage with a gas station in the 15th or 1500 to 1600 block of K Street Northwest that had some architectural elements at the entry. Is that accurate? Do you know of a building? This is something we could look into as well, I think.
There's two. I think that one was associated with Morris Cafritz, and maybe part of the original office building that was there that they since tore down. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is the Capitol Garage, but that's a little further east, I believe, or was a little further east on New York Avenue at like 13th Street. That building dates to 1927. It was unfortunately also torn down in the 70s. John Kelly did a great article on it back in the spring of this year in the Washington Post, in the John Kelly's Washington article. And he also cites an article that Kent Bass wrote about the same garage in one of his blog entries for Greater Washington. So those are two I would recommend. Those are easily found online. They're certainly worth reading. And I think probably the Morris Cafritz reference, I'll do a little more digging on that.
Great. Jim asks, did DC or the surrounding area have Art Deco style diners?
Oh, sure. There's a number of great diners. The Tasty Diner in Silver Spring, it's been moved at least once, but it's one of those classic, gleaming silver diner cars that it was then added on to over time. There's another one on Connecticut Avenue in Chevy Chase. I believe Bethesda has a great diner. And there's at least one in Prince George's County. I think it might be Hyattsville, but don't hold me to that. Yeah, there's some, and these are all still around. They may not be functioning or functioning in their original use in a couple of cases, but they're still with us.
She asks, what about the FTC headquarters and the Justice buildings? Don't they have Art Deco ornamental exterior features? And she says, thanks, great session and a real trip down memory lane.
Sure. So I believe she's referring to the buildings in Federal Triangle. Well, I think of the Justice, Department of Justice, and I guess the FTC also, they have some great Art Deco embellishment, and we could probably do a whole talk on Federal Triangle. We should at some point because it's an incredible complex. And on the one hand, it's a very consistent design applied to several buildings over a 30+ year history. And they all have a very pronounced, the heights are the same. There's a very pronounced base, middle, and top. And they all follow this very clear set of rules. But in the case of Justice, it takes it in an Art Deco direction, and there's some great decorative elements in the doors and these great torchlight light fixtures. And there's also some beautiful gates, and that actually, I guess, is a reference to transportation, because those gates, in a lot of cases, they're restricted entries now, but they were open to auto courts and below grade parking in some instances as well.
Wow. Nice. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So Deborah, she asks, that Star parking garage was fabulous. I had never focused on there being Art Deco parking garages. Do you happen to be aware of any others in the metro area?
Off the top of my head, no, Deborah. You all are giving me a to-do list here for further things to research. I am thankful. That's part of what makes this so fun, is you get questions that cause you to continue the search. I'm not aware of any, but I'm going to certainly do some digging to see what I can find.
Great. Okay, well, Judith asked if this is going to be recorded and going to be online. Yes, it will be. Kind of within the week, we hope to have this online. Right now, it is immediately available on our Facebook page. So when we send a follow-up email, there'll be a link to that. But with that, Steve, I don't know if you have any other final thoughts or anything that you would want people to kind of look out for, that maybe the Art Deco Society is doing right now.
Oh, goody. I get one more shameless plug. Thank you. Yeah, well, interestingly, we have another program coming up, virtual, this Thursday. It's focused on fashion, women's fashion during World War II. It should be very interesting. If you go to our website, I don't know if you've put that in the, did you put that in the chat?
The website is in the chat.
It's very simple. It's adsw.org. You can go to our events page. We are working with the Hildreth Mayer Foundation on a program in early spring, first weekend in April. We're going to look at, that'll be a symposium program in person, fingers crossed, looking at the work of great Art Deco era muralist Hildreth Mayer here in Washington. And then the last thing I wanted to mention is our annual antique show. It's known as the Modernism Show. It's kind of our banner event every year. And the last 2 years, like a lot of things, it was a virtual online sale. And we are thankfully returning to a live in-person show that will be at the National Masonic Memorial in Alexandria the last weekend in April. So thanks for the opportunity to plug a few things.
Oh, of course. Yeah, well, that all sounds amazing. So again, everybody, the link to their website is in the chat, so you can go ahead and sign up for these really interesting events that are coming up. And just before we officially end things here, I do want to say that as part of our 50th anniversary celebration next month, DCPL is looking at historic schools, universities, and libraries in the city. So please be on the lookout for an announcement about those programs that we have coming up. And then finally, registration is now open for the District of Columbia Awards for Excellence in Historic Preservation. It is going to be in person, held on Tuesday, February 15th at 7 p.m. at the Daughters of the American Revolution Constitution Hall. So that's free, that's open to the public, and we hope that you will join us. And with that, I just want to give another big thank you again to Steve for this amazing presentation. We really all learned a lot. And I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing you at future events and hope you have a great rest of your night.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Melissa. Great job. Thanks for sponsoring this.